Welcome to this module within the Policy Development course. This module is titled Legal Issues and Other Policy Considerations. I'm Bonnie McEwen, consultant with the Northwest District Office of the State Library. You're welcome to contact me with any follow-up questions regarding this class. You can refer back to this slide for my contact information, or you can find me on the Contact Us page on the State Library's website. We'll begin this module by looking at legal issues regarding developing policy, and follow that with a look at some important but sometimes overlooked policy topics to include. I'll have suggestions for looking at the policies that boards approve as an opportunity for public education, and we'll finish up with ideas for setting up a policy revision schedule. Let's begin with legal considerations. How can library boards and management do their best work to ensure that the policies being adopted can also be enforceable? For instance, public library boards have to comply with Iowa's open meetings laws. They have to hire according to equal opportunity law. They have to ensure that library upholds patron confidentiality. Policy regulations, as explained in an earlier module, have to be reasonable with reasonable consequences. Policy should be clear, applied to all users fairly, and when the topic is sufficiently complicated, boards are well advised to consult with their city attorney. Let's take each of these in turn. Two good examples of library policies that must comply with local statutes are shown here on this slide. On the left side, Iowa open meetings laws, detailed in Chapter 21 of the Iowa Code, includes public library boards as one of those governmental bodies that must comply with Iowa open meetings law. I encourage library boards to include reference to this state law in their bylaws, helping to inform and instruct all trustees that they must comply with this state law. On the right side of the slide, Iowa Code Chapter 22.7 speaks to the fact that public library circulation records are considered confidential records in Iowa. Public libraries must uphold patron privacy, pledging that any linkage between a person's identity and what they've checked out of the library is a matter of patron confidentiality. Circulation records should only be released by the custodian of the record, typically that's been designated as the library director, and usually only upon a subpoena. Library boards should include reference to Iowa Code Chapter 22.7 within their circulation policy. For more detail about both of these Iowa statutes, look inside the Iowa Code online. The second test of whether a policy is legally enforceable is whether the policy regulations and corresponding penalties are reasonable. This circulation policy from LeClaire, Iowa, is a good example of reasonable regulations and reasonable consequences. LeClaire's circulation policy reads that circulation and some remote access privileges will be blocked for patrons with $5 or more in fines, with 5 or more overdue items, with long-standing, long overdue materials or billed items. LeClaire's policy goes on to say that with persons with expired cards, circulation and other access privileges will be blocked when a patron's library card expires. So again, these are reasonable and common consequences for overdue and lost items. An unreasonable penalty would be to bar patrons with overdue materials from using or entering the library building entirely. That would be an unreasonable consequence for loss or overdue materials. A third test of whether a policy is legally enforceable is whether the policy is clear and unambiguous. This circulation policy from Waterloo Public Library is a good example of setting up clear expectations for how long library materials can be checked out. From Waterloo Library's policy, we can see that books, audiobooks, and playaways have a 3-week checkout with up to 2 3-week renewals. TV series on DVD check out for 1 week with up to 2 1-week renewals. Magazines, if they are brand new issues, check out for 1 week with no renewal, but older issues of magazines check out for 3 weeks with a 3-week renewal. Again, this is a good example of setting up clear expectations for people checking out library materials. A fourth test of whether a policy is legally enforceable is whether it is being applied fairly and without discrimination. A strong example of this ideal comes to us from the American Library Association. For decades, ALA has been at the forefront of guiding public libraries across the country in developing policies and practices that uphold equal access to information without regard to race, age, or gender. There is a tendency to limit library access to minors. But minors have First Amendment rights too, and ALA provides the best in national advocacy regarding a minor's access to library materials. The text showing here are interpretations of the Library Bill of Rights. One is access to library resources and services for minors. The other is minors and online activity. Learn more about these and other intellectual freedom documents at the ALA website. And be sure to reference these intellectual freedom statements into your own library policies. Lastly, when policy topics are sufficiently complicated, or if policy topics have never been addressed before, then library boards are well advised to consult with the city attorney. This slide has an example. Nothing about the pandemic of 2020 was easy, personally or professionally. But I have to think that decisions would have been made easier if they could have been made in stronger coordination and with better communication with their most likely partners, city administrators, mayors, councils, and city attorneys. In 2020, I was glad to have had this conversation with Helen Rigdon, director of the Sioux City Public Library. This shows a strong involvement with the city library and its parent city government, specifically here, the Sioux City Attorney. Back in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, the Sioux City City Attorney instructed all city buildings to ensure accessibility to public restrooms once city buildings reopened. All city services did not have to open on the same day at the same pace. Phased reopenings were encouraged, but once reopened, upon the advice of the Sioux City City Attorney, even if normal service hours were reduced, city buildings must have accessible restrooms open to the public. A good example of keeping within your library policies being enforceable is to consult with, receive advice from your city attorney. For more information about legal issues surrounding library policies, I'll refer you to this resource on the State Library's website. Mandy Easter with the State Law Library has compiled frequently asked legal questions into a searchable database. These are legal-related questions that Iowa libraries have asked, and Mandy has answered in a Q&A format, posting this collection on our website. The link is provided on the slide. From personnel issues to fundraising questions, from board authority to city government responsibility. Visit this important resource on the State Library's website, Library Law FAQs. Let's circle back to standards and look again at standard number 7, which requires, at a Tier 1 level, that libraries adopt 4 required policies: circulation, collections, personnel, and internet use. Standard number 7 and over 80 more are found in the publication shown here, In Service to Iowa Public Library Standards. This is a publication of the State Library and an important resource for boards, directors, and staff to know about. Standard number 9. While not a required standard, it does encourage boards to adopt at least 2 additional policy topics in addition to the 4 that we just referenced. Those additional policy topics could be on the library's position on public programming, on providing bulletin boards, displays, or exhibits. An additional policy could surround what the library determines to be its closed holidays throughout the year and how it makes decisions about inclement weather closings. An additional policy could surround the library's use of social media. As you turn to your own library's policy manual, you'll discover which of these additional policy topics your board has addressed and which ones perhaps they haven't. The next few slides offer examples of some of these, not all. I've just chosen a few of these to highlight. I'll lead off with this one because it's a pet peeve of mine, quite honestly. Public libraries, in my experience, need to do a better job, a more consistent job of addressing when the library will close for inclement weather and what holidays the library will observe throughout the year. Follow the lead of Grimes Public Library in Iowa. Grimes Library has decided and documented in policy, in writing, and shared on their website which holidays the library observes so that the community knows when the library is expected to be closed. Here's a year-at-a-glance chart determined well in advance which holidays Grimes Public Library will observe in calendar year 2021. This is so simple to do, but so important to do, so that these holiday decisions are not decided days before the event, but instead decided well in advance for an entire calendar year. Here's how Grimes Public Library Board has addressed closing for inclement weather. Now, this can be a more subjective decision. It's not as clear-cut as holidays, but how to handle inclement weather closings is still an important thing to talk about. It's made a little easier when the library takes its cue from other agencies. As you can see, Grimes Library relies on information from the Iowa DOT, from area schools, and from City Hall on those days of inclement weather. Here's a good example of a social media policy, one of those topics that's not very often addressed in small libraries. It's more often found, I believe, in mid-sized to larger libraries, but a social media policy is seldom found in smaller towns. That's why I was happy to find this addressed at Sibley Public Library. So it takes up a policy topic not frequently addressed, and it also serves up a good example of the philosophy behind the library using social media. You can see from Sibley Library's philosophy that reads, through the library's social media messages, we are fulfilling our mission to inspire lifelong learning, promote new resources, and raise cultural awareness. Much of the content relates to libraries, books, authors, and the book publishing industry. The policy goes on to highlight the library's goals in connection with its social media efforts to inform the public about library activities, to increase the public's use of library resources, to provide additional communication with the community. Definitely the why, the philosophy behind the library's use of social media. This is a nice example of a programming policy. This comes from Marion, Iowa Public Library. And like a social media policy, in my experience, public programming is a topic that's not very commonly addressed. What goes into the library providing public programs. But Marion, Iowa has done it very well with a very strong philosophy statement to boot. Marion's policy reads, the purpose of library programming is to promote early literacy, to promote a lifelong love of reading and learning, to foster cultural awareness and civic engagement, to share local talent, knowledge, and expertise. A nice example of a public programming policy. Back to standard number 7, because at this point we've looked at the 4 required policies: circulation, collection development, personnel, and internet use. But note, standard 7 goes on to say that policies are available to staff members and for public inspection. We'll talk about staff access to library policies coming up, but for now let's talk about making library policies available for public inspection. Public-facing policies are those policies that community members most need to know. Topics like applying for library cards, using the library's Wi-Fi, using the library's internet computers, accessing bridges and other digital products. These policies are logical ones to post on the library's website, and explanations are logical things to provide to people via flyers or fact sheets. Policies can be a very good opportunity for the library to engage in some public education. Let's look at how. Since the 1930s, public libraries across the country have endorsed the principles of intellectual freedom, starting with the Library Bill of Rights, which actually originated in Iowa at the Public Library of Des Moines. Continuing with the freedom to read statement and the freedom to view statement and so many more corresponding intellectual freedom statements. These documents are really cornerstones of a public library's purpose: to provide equal access to a broad range of thought and opinion through the library's physical and digital collections. Now, library boards, managers, and staff know this. But to put this into the context of policies as an opportunity for public education, how many of your community members are familiar with the library's support of intellectual freedom? How many in city government are familiar? How many in county government? Likely not many people outside of library circles, which makes incorporating these documents into library policy so important, and it makes sharing these documents so important from a public education standpoint. Here's another great example of public education regarding public library policies and services. Sioux City Public Library has been defining patrons and defining service for decades. They're not alone in having these policies in place. Many other cities have done this also, but I like to showcase Sioux City's model because there is lots to be learned from this. On their website, they've clearly defined who is eligible for a full-service library card. They spell out ages, residencies, they address open access borrowers. Now, this screenshot is an abbreviated version of their circulation policy that the board adopted. That full circulation policy is linked from the library's website, and it more completely defines those patron types, those people who can receive a full service library card. I want to make one more note about this slide, and it's to call your attention to the last line on the slide. A simple declarative sentence that reads, Sioux City Public Library is funded through city property tax dollars. That's one declarative sentence, one important statement that any Iowa Public Library can replicate, and it's an important statement because it leads to improved taxpayer education. Now, this example from Marshalltown, Iowa, is a nice example promoting Marshalltown Library Friends Group. Now, friends groups are typically a small percentage of the city's population as a whole, and like many things surrounding library service, there may be people that are simply not aware that there is a library friends group. There may be people in your community who are not aware if your library has a friends group. There may be people who are unaware of the projects that the friends group sponsors on behalf of the library. People who are unsure if they themselves could join a friends group, how would they go about that? Or people who are uncertain of how they themselves could donate to the friends group. Well, let's do some public education surrounding your library's friends group, as Marshalltown has done, and include a very visible donate to the library's friends group with a button on their website. It's a good example of promoting library services, in this case, of promoting the Marshalltown Friends Group, and it also leads to increased awareness, increased public education, increased awareness that the library is supported by a friends group. I like this approach to sharing public policies on the library's website. It's an FAQ approach. I think it's a friendly way of relaying policy information because these are answers to people's most frequently asked questions. And the answers to people's most frequently asked questions are usually policy decisions. Of course, it's still good to post your library policies in their entirety on your website, but this kind of a front-facing, frequently asked questions display is a nice visual way of sharing policy information and doing public education at the same time. Back to standard number 7, which has a lot to say about the 4 required policies, about having the policies available to staff and for public inspection, which we've talked about, but Standard 7 goes on to talk about how those 4 required policies must be reviewed at least every 3 years. Now, the other points on the slide are mine. The other points are my suggestions for the policy review process. Don't attempt to examine and revise all these policies in 1 or 2 or even 3 board meetings. That's a lot to tackle in too short an amount of time. It's much easier to schedule various topics throughout your 3-year cycle. Be sure to date every revision that's made. And try this tip. Try bringing a year at a glance calendar to the process. An example of that is coming up. A frequent question that comes from hearing about policies for results, as we've discussed in previous modules, Is the question, should staff procedures be pulled from the rest of the policy handbook and kept separately? And I think yes. I think it's a more convenient and logical thing to have a procedures manual readily accessible for the staff, filed apart from the formal policy parts that the board approves. So putting your policies that the board approves, along with the procedures, which are staff work routines that the staff works their way through. Putting those in a 3-ring binder is fine. It's pretty typical. But as more and more things in our lives are saved to the cloud, you might want to consider using some cloud-based product like Google Docs or Microsoft OneNote or even Live Binders. Live Binders is a website that allows you to create digital binders with the same look and feel of the familiar 3-ring binders that we all have sitting on our shelves. Live Binders are, of course, online in the cloud, easy to access, easy to share, and easy to update from anywhere. So do consider a cloud application for storing not just the staff's procedures that they develop after the board adopts its philosophies and its regulations, but consider using a live binder for the actual policies that the board adopts as well as the staff procedures. Now, this is a practice I've long been encouraging library boards to use, and that is to use a year at a glance calendar to plot those things that the board needs to discuss at its meetings throughout the year. Using a board business calendar, like this example, leads to consistency. It leads to a systematic approach for reviewing policies. For example, the board could target February as the month to renew or review the collection policy. The board could target April as the month to review the circulation policy. So protecting various months of the year to review those 4 required policies and other actions that the board is required to do, like the director's performance evaluation, like evaluating its strategic plan, protecting various months of the year to review those things gives the board a collective memory. It makes board agenda development so much easier, and it allows the board time to plan and adjust. It's all flexible. Well, to begin to wrap up then, in addition to the policy examples from select Iowa libraries that I've shown in this and previous modules, the next 2 slides offer 2 very reliable and authoritative sources to find more sample library policies. Back to the ALA website. The American Library Association is the oldest and the largest association in the world, dating back to 1876. One crucial role for ALA is to advocate for all types of libraries, whether public, school, or college, to help raise awareness that libraries are a public good and essential service. And another vital role for ALA is to provide a national and unified defense of intellectual freedom. Defending intellectual freedom is a critical advocacy role of local library boards, requiring thoughtful public policy. So explore ALA's website to access intellectual freedom statements, interpretations, and share these with your board so that your board can endorse these same intellectual freedom positions. This source for sample policies is thanks to a partnership between the Colorado State Library and the Association for Rural and Small Libraries. This is a compilation of policy topics contributed by library practitioners in Colorado. Among the topics you can find here, working with volunteers, meeting rooms, expected patron behavior, lending wireless hotspots, and so much more. Visit the CLIC site, which stands for the Colorado Library Consortium, at the link showing on the slide to access this compilation of library policies. To wrap up this policies course, through our 4 individual modules, we've come to learn that thoughtful public policies should be developed through study, input, and discussion involving the library director, the staff, the board, always considering the safety and welfare of your community residents. Thoughtful public policy should establish service regulations and rules of conduct that are readily understood by staff and users alike. Public policy must be consistent with local, state, and federal law. And thoughtful public policy must ensure the equal treatment for all ages and races, providing a framework for the consistent delivery of library service free of discriminatory practices. This concludes this 4th module within the policy development course. This has been legal issues and other policy considerations. Good luck as you continue your endorsement program, and be sure to reach out to us at the State Library with any questions.